Good afternoon, everybody. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I kindly request everyone to put your mobile phones on silent for the duration of the program. Thank you. I'm Preeti Daga, and on behalf of Community Housing Limited, I warmly welcome you all and those who have joined virtually to this special memorial to remember and honor our late founding managing director, Steve Bevington, and to reflect and celebrate his many contributions and legacy to the community housing sector in Australia and beyond. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here today, including current and former CHL staff, board members, sector colleagues, partners, associates, and friends of Steve. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Steve's family, Stella, Max, and Roland, who are here with us today, and Lucy and Henry and their extended families who are watching this event from overseas. Thank you for all your support and generosity in the lead up to this event. On behalf of everyone at CHL, I offer our deepest condolences to you and your family. 3 decades ago, Steve made his mark in community housing in Australia, establishing CHL right here in Victoria. His vision and dedication had laid the foundation for an organization that would go on to change countless lives. For more than half of that time, I had the privilege of working closely with Steve, starting with the role of a media coordinator and eventually advancing to my current position as head of PR and digital marketing. That's a long time, but there was never a dull moment with Steve at the helm. He was incredibly hardworking and an even harder taskmaster, constantly challenging anybody who worked directly with him to think outside the box. As a newly minted migrant in this country, a phrase Steve often used with me, working alongside him was filled with constant learning and growth. His wisdom and his guidance has shaped my professional and personal journey in many profound ways, and I will always be grateful for the opportunity. Whenever he would say, "So, what do you think, guys? Let's do it," we knew we were about to embark on a bold and exciting venture. Perhaps Nike was inspired by Steve and coined their tagline in the 1980s, "Just do it." But beneath his serious exterior, Steve was deeply caring. He cared for both the staff and our customers, impressively knowing everyone by their first name for the longest time and engaging with them with deep respect and interest. At the start, I often wondered how Steve maintained his motivation and rigor day after day. That's when I found out that his commitment and energy found roots in his early life in the UK. Not many know about his younger days, so if you'd allow me to share briefly. Steve began his career in the late 1970s as a bus conductor and bookshop assistant. He then transitioned into construction in Oxford, took some time to learn carpentry. Now, some of you may know he built his first house in Victoria himself. He then went on to work on building sites on motorways in Germany, collecting many thrilling experiences along the way. But during a time of housing shortage in 1980s Britain, Steve found a home on Georgiana Street in the London borough of Camden, where he began squatting with friends from Oxford. It was there that Steve's passion for affordable housing was really ignited. This group of friends transformed the row of terrace houses on Georgiana Street into a housing cooperative. And by 1986, Steve was elected to the Camden Council and eventually chaired the Camden Council Housing Authority. And shortly after, he moved to Australia. He created a beautiful home with his family, and the rest is history. Steve was a visionary leader, a change maker, a relentless and passionate advocate for social justice, and as many have described him, an absolute legend of the community and social housing industry. His impact on community housing extends far beyond the projects that have been completed. It is reflected in the countless lives that have been positively touched and the communities CHL has created in the last 30 years under his leadership. Thank you for your vision and service, Steve. Like many, I will miss your energy, your wisdom, and of course, your big laugh. Rest in peace. Well, today we're going to hear from some of Steve's long-standing friends and colleagues, including board members, Chris Shields, Penny Kendall, Fiona Skiotis, our long-term staff members, Fiona Clark, Jocelino Alves, Stacy Broadbent, former chair board member Michael Lennon, and our CEO, Danny Drasic, who pay their tributes and share their reflections. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Chris Shields, CHL's inaugural chair, to share his thoughts.
Thanks, Preeti. We are here with a heavy heart today. It's not what we expected for the 30th anniversary of CHL. It's great to see so many here to remember Steve. I met Steve in '94 when I was appointed to the CHL board. I remember seeing Steve set up a desk in the shared space with Common Equity Housing Limited. It's incredible to think the company that started with one desk, Steve and the board, and it's now active in all Australian states and territories, with international operations in East Timor, India, Chile, Peru, Indonesia and Rwanda, with over 12,000 residences under management. Steve's absolute determination to pursue the company motto of a world without housing poverty drove him to success. I remember when that motto was agreed. We gathered for a strategic planning conference, back when we could all gather in one place. Steve was guiding us along, as many ideas scribbled and placed on butter paper. A bit of alcohol was consumed to help with team building and to keep thoughts flowing. I retired early, but I heard later that many continued till almost dawn, including Steve. Out of that, the overwhelming consensus was to have a world focus and not confine our efforts to Australia. And so a world without housing poverty was born. After I was appointed chair of CHL, Steve and I would meet over lunch about a week before each board meeting. We discussed latest developments, roadblocks and how the company endeavours were proceeding. It was mostly Steve talking and me trying to keep up with all that was going on. There was always a laugh and great camaraderie as we shared ambitious goals for CHL. Steve, I can say in most respects those goals have been achieved. I'm immensely proud of what has been achieved by CHL over the past 30 years. The company that Steve led has helped over 1 million people, by my estimation, to avoid housing poverty. Steve invited me to be his best man at his wedding to Beatrice in Uganda in 2015. It was a wonderful traditional ceremony with music and dancing. After the ceremony, I tagged along on their mini honeymoon at Ginger, an hour out of Kampala on Lake Victoria at the source of the Nile River. I hope you can picture this. Steve on his honeymoon, meeting at the hotel pool to cool off, paddling about together, and all Steve talked about was CHL plans and activities. He never switched off. Who hasn't received a 3 a.m. email from Steve? I don't think he ever slept. Another enduring memory of Steve was our fact-finding mission to Chile as we commenced operations there. It was Steve, Michael Beer, the company manager, and myself. We'd been invited to meet Mapuche representatives to see their situation and assess if we could help them. We visited a small trout farm they operated to give some income for their people. They lived hand to mouth in shacks with dirt floors. We each caught a trout, and Steve was quite delighted with his catch. They took us to a traditional Ruka house in a centre displaying their culture, a museum, if you will. The fire was burning in the centre of the thatched roof and walled house, with smoke wafting out the hole at the peak of the roof. Our host took the fish and proceeded to cook on the open fire with lemon and salt. And so Steve, Michael and I sat eating fresh fish in a smoke haze in a Ruka in Chile. I hope that conjures up some of the image there of that moment that's an enduring memory for me. We did help them with 25 housing units that were completed in 2016, which were very well received. I was honoured to attend Steve's funeral with his family and friends. I was very touched to hear the personal testimonies and to see how his family and friends appreciated and loved him. For me, it was an honour to work with Steve, and I treasure what we achieved together. Having known Steve for 30 years and knowing something of his personal struggle, I believe he was searching for love. And it's clear from those here today that he is loved by many. So I pray that helps him to rest in peace. Vale, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Penny Kendall, and I've been a board member on and off over the last 25 odd years. I first met Steve at the end of 1995. CHL was barely 2 years old, and I had commenced working for a disability organisation who had received significant funding to design, build and property manage purpose-built homes in the local community. And they were going to be for 42 children and adults with severe and complex intellectual and physical disabilities leaving an institutional setting. As Steve and I discussed only the week before he passed away about the process that CHL undertook for this project, it was one of the largest at the time, and for CHL, the first to be designed specifically for people with a disability. Steve had little knowledge of what that would mean, but in true Steve style, he made it his business to find out. The process that CHL undertook was groundbreaking and certainly not expected. The consultation, the collaboration, the respect and the compassion that was shown to people with a disability and their families was inclusive and innovative. Every person was involved in the entire process. The smallest of details, their opinion was sought and valued. The final product, 7 purpose-built homes, which is state-of-the-art and still, almost 30 years later, considered a model to emulate. In almost 30 years that I've been privileged to be part of CHL and Steve's journey to see the progress and the desire within him to ensure that vulnerable and marginalised people have access to safe, secure and affordable housing that has enriched their lives. From a small community housing provider in the eastern suburbs to the largest in Australia, with links and subsidiaries to many other countries, Steve was enormously proud of the organisation that he built and understood how his vision had changed people's lives. Having a roof over your head that is stable and secure improves and empowers the life of individuals and makes measurable difference. This is a powerful achievement. As many others have said, Steve Bevington was a visionary, but he was much more than that because he understood the power of advocacy. The people who are marginalised and vulnerable need more than one voice to get what they need. The power of resilience, that people need support to withstand, adapt and recover from their adversity. The power of perseverance, that people can overcome the challenge when they work together despite the difficulties and obstacles. This is what he did. This is how he achieved his goal. He understood what it meant to have a safe and secure and sustainable house. He had lived experience, which motivated his drive to ensure others would benefit from a world without housing poverty. The vision of CHL. Steve's vision, a vision that has not been altered, has not been modified, and has not wavered along the journey. It was his dream, his motivation, and his mantra. Steve had a strong sense of purpose and the ability to inspire and motivate others towards the common goal. We are all better off for his foresight, for his vision, for his drive, and for his empathy. Fail, Steve.
Steve Bevington was a humble giant of the housing world. I heard of him before I met him in the gossipy, sometimes petty world of the Melbourne community housing sector in the early 90s. His arrival on the scene was accompanied by wild rumours and half-truths of a corporate Machiavelli hell-bent on gobbling up small housing groups. When I finally met him, he was clearly nothing of the sort. I was immediately struck by his intelligence, his candid and amiable engagement, and steely determination. Steve was a natural entrepreneur who could have made a fortune in the private sector, but chose instead to devote his considerable talents to not-for-profit work, as he had a tremendous passion for mission, or as he pronounced it, mission. It was this, I think, that spurred him to his most significant efforts and achievements. He was a natural leader with vision, smarts in abundance, but also compassion and real gravitas, a quality he took seriously and sometimes found wanting in others. He was the hardest working person I've ever known, giving of himself unsparingly and never failing or flagging. How he did it, I've no idea. He seemed to be available for every meeting, and there were oh so many meetings, at any hour of the day or night, no matter where he was in the world. When CHL went international, most meetings would begin with, "Where are you now, Steve?" And in reality, he could be almost anywhere. Steve was a colleague for over 30 years, a sector colleague, a fellow board director for over 20, and someone I'm proud to have called a friend for around half my life. He was even briefly my boss for a matter of weeks in 2001, when he headhunted me from another community housing role. A month or so after starting at Box Hill, I was offered what seemed to be a dream job, so I gave notice. Steve was not surprisingly unenthusiastic about that. People voluntarily departing CHL was a rare thing at that time. But after he got over his annoyance, he suggested I make amends by joining the CHL board. In fact, this was no hardship, and I happily stepped up to that role and remain in it today. Being on the board of CHL was an exhilarating roller coaster ride in those days, as we non-executive directors hung on for dear life, and CHL grew and grew and grew under Steve's magic touch. I think Steve and I were closest when we had our backs against the wall some years ago, fighting to save CHL from what could be described as a hostile takeover. It was a close-run thing, but Steve had real grit and wasn't about to hand over his creation and legacy to people he held in distinctly low regard. We organised furiously, and after what was, for me as chair, a truly nail-biting AGM, and with the support of some loyal friends who had also passed on drinking the Kool-Aid, we carried the day. That experience of working with Steve to safeguard the company and its mission from the none-too-tender ministrations of neoliberal lightweights has given me some treasured memories. Steve had a rather British reserve and a clear preference for understatement and modesty. He was suspicious of plaudits and gongs and disdainful of those who celebrated them, particularly if their records were self-evidently meagre. I recall his mocking scorn for one high-ranking bureaucrat from a certain state, I won't mention which, who had arranged things so that visitors to his office had to pass through a corridor bedecked with trophies and prizes. This was the same bureaucrat who had held up the development of community housing in his state at every turn. I can still see Steve's sourly, unimpressed face now. Steve passed away without much in the way of formal recognition. No Order of the Grand Poobah for him. This seems sad on the one hand, given his immense achievements compared to many of those so awarded. But it is also quite fitting, as I recall Steve's view that the only truly meaningful legacy for anyone working in housing was the number of homes built and people and families housed. On this measure, it's clear Steve stands as perhaps the very grandest poobah of them all in the Australian housing sector. I'll miss Steve, and I know many others will feel the same way. His untimely departure has left what is at times an aching hole in our world. But Steve was a pretty unsentimental chap, and I'm sure he'd want us all just to get on with things the best we know how. So my way of coping with his loss is to recommit myself to the work and mission that Steve devoted himself to so wholeheartedly and successfully. It's my great hope that CHL and its many subsidiaries and offshoots will do likewise in the years to come. In closing, and with that commitment in mind, I'm very proud to announce here today the establishment of the Steve Bevington Foundation, a charitable body that will devote itself to pursuing Steve's vision of a world without housing poverty in those developing parts of the world that he visited so often and cared for so deeply. Stay tuned on that one, folks. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Steve's early passing has been a shock and a great loss to us all. I first met Steve as part of the regional community housing staffing team, sharing an office with Common Equity Housing in the CBD. There would be three of us: Steve, Simon Harvey, our architect, and myself. In those early days, Steve's stories kept me intrigued. I started to understand what had shaped Steve's thinking and why he was so passionate about the social housing. He loved to chat about his housing and life experience in London, and he was motivated by his own housing experiencing. I discovered he had worked as a carpenter in the building industry in England and Germany. He later became a member of the London Housing Cooperative and worked for Camden Borough Council managing housing. Somewhere in amongst all of this, I recall him telling me he worked as a bus conductor and would often change the bus route to drop friends off who needed to be closer to home. On a more personal note, being a newly arrived migrant myself, it was a comfort to chat to Steve, who was able to relate and always to provide good advice. Our conversations would often turn to the UK housing system, the Maggie Thatcher era, or a sporting event. During these chats, I discovered that he was building his own home and he was a keen follower of astrology. In the early days of CHL, a star sign could well influence a staff appointment. I recall when Steve was preparing the tender submission for the newly formed Transitional Housing Programme and Homelessness Services. He spent weeks prior banging away on the keyboard preparing the tender. Steve recently retold the story of how on the day the tender was due, he was stuck on the freeway due to a car accident. He was frantically calling me to tell me to ring the Office of Housing to say we had a problem. Steve later told me that he was out of the car, pacing up and down the Eastern Freeway, ranting and gesticulating when somebody said, "Hey mate, calm down, it can't be that bad." Fortunately, Steve navigated his way through, double parked, ran in and threw the huge bundle of tender documents in the tender box. We were minutes away from missing out on our first growth opportunity to establish CHL. I admired Steve, as he always considers our clients in his decision-making. At every opportunity, he took the time to speak to staff to understand the demands and the trends in the delivery of our services. To quote Steve from an interview, "My experience sleeping on the streets and insecure short-term housing will never leave me. It is a powerful motivator and is the reason why I do what I do every day." Steve always had the time to discuss a problem or approach a new challenge or just for a chat. When I said, "Got a minute?" he would always stop what he was doing and give you the time. He often had a straightforward solution to a complex situation. On many occasions, Steve supported staff when they were experiencing their own life challenges. From my own perspective, when I managed family loss in Scotland, Steve ensured that I have the support of CHL and the time to manage it through. I was aware of his support for many other CHL staff members over the years. On the amusing side, Steve only typed with 2 fingers. Tenders, board papers, emails, always with 2 fingers. I would comment on this and he would laugh. Depending on the seriousness of the email or document, he would press harder on the keyboard. If I could hear him banging away loudly, I would think, I hope that email doesn't land in my inbox. From the outset, I had great admiration and respect for Steve for his vision and commitment. That was 28 years ago. And as I reflect, I am still of that mind and have great respect for Steve, for all his achievements and the realisation of his vision. Steve's legacy is not just about CHL and houses, it is about the ideas, the concepts and values and the ideals. We know that Steve's legacy will be with us for a very long time and he will be dearly missed. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, esteemed college and cherished friends and family of Steve Bevington. I'm honored to stand before you today to pay tribute to remarkable man, Steve Bevington. On behalf of myself and all the staff at CHL Timor, I extend our deepest condolence to Steve's family. Steve was more than a superior. He was a mentor and a friend. His humility and approachability made every conversation with him meaningful and enriching. Steve visited Timor-Leste in 2002. 2 years after our independence, when our country was in turmoil, many homes were destroyed. On his second visit, he brought Seattle architects Simon Harvey with a determined vision to help rebuild our nation. I first met Steve in mid-2004 during an interview for a senior project position at Seattle out of 10 to 12 candidates. I was selected to become the first Timorese to work with Seattle. From the beginning, Steve understood that rebuilding our housing sector required more than just structures. It needs skilled people. Steve's vision was to enhance human capacity through practical training, making Seattle Timor unique among Seattle international operations. He believed in building quality homes by training locals in skills such as bricklaying, carpentry, in fact, he's a carpenter, plumbing, and electrical work. We also train young architects, engineers, preparing them for the real projects, management, and construction. In 2005, we complete our first project under Steve's guidance, donating 7 houses to Ministry of Social Solidarity in Tibor. I think Chris Shield was there for the inauguration. This project will successfully combine local community workers with a fresh graduate from Tibor vocational training. Steve's commitment was evident as we collaborate with government, NGOs, and the Catholic Church to build schools, shelters, and training centers. Despite ongoing housing challenges in Timor-Leste, Steve remains committed. He led many seminars advocating for housing solutions, even as land title issues persisted. One notable project was constructed of 72 houses in Lohora Iswai with the government of Timor-Leste. This project trained 300 workers, enabling the community to build their own homes, a true testament to Steve's belief, empowering people through knowledge. Steve always insists on including a training component in every Seattle Timor projects. He believed that every project was an opportunity to learn and grow, making Seattle stand out. His constant requires about the numbers of people trained and employed by Seattle underscores his deep care for improving people's lives. I will forever remember Steve's word to me, quote, Jocelyn, if you want to get respect from people, you have to stand on your own feet to be able to help people, others. Steve, you may have left us, but your legacy lives on. Your good deeds continue to inspire us in Timor. I'm profoundly grateful for the opportunity to have learned from you and carry forward your vision. Thank you, Steve. Rest in peace. Descansa en paz. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands in which we are here today to honour Steve. Auntie Maureen O'Mara of the ACHL board was meant to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't make it, so I've been thrown into this in a positive light by Danny and Preeti. My name is Stacy Broadbent. I'm the CEO of Aboriginal Community Housing Limited, and I don't have a paper with me because I was just informed of this a few hours ago, so I'm going to speak from the heart. I knew of the man, Steve Bevington, before I knew Steve Bevington. And what I mean by that is that I knew of Steve Bevington for a large number of years through my previous employment in the regulator's office. So obviously regulating CHL and ACHL. Then I got the opportunity to work with Steve Bevington, which meant I got to understand and know Steve Bevington. Part of Steve's thinking in relation to ACHL was to ensure that Aboriginal communities or First Nation communities would have access to safe, stable accommodation. In establishing ACHL, it wasn't just because Steve wanted it. Steve went out and worked with a number of Aboriginal communities by consultation or negotiation to ensure that we were able, or he was, or CHL was I should say, able to establish an organisation from a national perspective that could focus on all First Nations people. We've been established now for just short of 7 years, and I'd like to think that we've achieved a fair bit during that time under the leadership and the guidance of Steve, and we're very grateful to him for having the foresight to work alongside us as our ally, to be able to walk alongside us as our ally, to provide safe, stable accommodation to Aboriginal people. When we talk about Steve, I've heard everyone's stories here today, and it's funny that Fee mentioned about the star signs, because my relationship with Steve was always really interesting. When we were best of mates, we were best of mates. When we were worst of enemies, we were worst of enemies. We're both fire signs. He's a Sagittarius, I'm an Aries. It can be explosive. So when we were best of mates, he was Bevo to me. He wasn't Steve, he was Bevo. When we were best of mates, he was Stephen Bevington. And he knew when he got a phone call from me and it started off with, "Hey Stace, Stephen Bevington, what have you done?" And that was how we framed some of those conversations. He was one of the most compassionate, caring, empathetic people I have had the honour of knowing. I know that my board views him not just as Steve, but also as a brother. And I know that my team views him not just as Steve, but as Uncle Steve. And if anybody understands anything about Aboriginal culture, if you're given a coined or you're given a standing as brother or uncle, that means you're taken deep within our hearts. As I said, he was our ally. He wasn't a martyr or a saviour. He walks alongside us and still does to this day. Before I wrap up, I want to just share a really funny story that just happened a couple of months ago. I think it was March or April, and he was working on what Fiona said, "Where are you today, Steve?" Well, that day he was in Indonesia, and he was working outside the office, and it was myself and one of my team members, Sarah. We were meeting with him to discuss. I was probably having a moment, if I'm being honest, like I normally do. We were discussing something about, I'm inclined to say it was Victoria, but something along those lines. And he walked into the meeting, or he sat down in the meeting, and looked real, put together, real spiffy, and we couldn't help but have a bit of a jab at him and go, "Oh, fancy schmancy, what's going on here, mate?" And he had this beautiful batik shirt on. And he's like, "Oh, it's on Thursdays in the office here, it's traditional dress Thursdays." I was like, "Oh my God, that's so cool. How cool is this?" He's like, "Yes, Days." And I was like, "Oh, maybe that's something CHL can do. That'd be really great." He's like, yeah, we should get ACHL to do it." Sarah and I were completely silent, waiting for the ball to drop. We're like, And he's going, What? I said, Yep, that would work great for the men with their laps on, and that'd be great. I know from my perspective I'd probably get a lot of decisions agreed to, but And it took a while, and you could see when the penny dropped, and the poor fella, his face went as red as a lap, and he just busted out with his huge, enormous laugh. We spent probably the next 5 minutes just digging at each other about this. And as part of the celebration, I was going to actually get Steve a lap made because, I thought, how more fitting can that be? But it was just his sense of humour and his faux pas were always something that were quite infamous. So I'm very thankful and grateful that I got the opportunity to know Steve Bevington, and I would like to thank his family for sharing your dad with us, because we got an uncle and my board got a brother out of it, so thank you so much.
I'd like to begin by thanking CHL and the Bevington family for the privilege of being here today. 25 years ago, the eminent Harvard academic Robert Punton wrote a groundbreaking book called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of the American Community, in which he demonstrated that America was transforming from a nation of joiners to a nation of loners, going to church less, joining clubs less, and, he warned, losing trust in each other and our institutions. Since then, the world has become more divided and less confident about the way forward. What he wrote about gets more relevant each day, as we all know. More social isolation seen in every facet of our lives, unparalleled personal isolation and mental illness, bad for health, but bad for each other. Lonely people are vulnerable to appeals of some false sense of purpose. We all know the young lonely men who drifted into Italy, Germany, and the UK and elsewhere in the 1930s. Punman identified two types of social capital: bonding social capital, that is with people like yourself, and bridging social capital, people unlike yourself, but with whom you can join and share something new. So bonding social capital can be bad. The Ku Klux Klan is an example. But bridging capital, he said, is hard and much, much, much more important. So people are, even more so through social media, isolated, lonely, and living in a very unequal society. So reflecting on this today, Steve Bevington's work life can be seen as someone who intimately understood what happens and what was going on around him. And he created a concept, a method, a service which responded to those circumstances. In his life's work, Steve gave us a title in community housing, but no, a brand and more a purpose for all of this in community housing. With this, Steve fashioned a unique intervention between market and government, which sought not only to build shelter, but to support community. As our housing circumstances have got ever worse, community housing has been the only source of growth in non-market housing over the past 10 years and is now almost universally seen as the preferred model for social and affordable housing. In this, he sought not only to build an organisation, but a whole provider model, a sector to which he devoted himself. And we have people here today from Chia, I saw Wendy before, from Power Housing, David and Scott are here, from Shelter. Where I worked with him in Chia, he was a relentless champion of the sector. He fought for endless reforms of rent assistance, for tenants' rights, and for a better deal from public policy. I have often wondered where this drive came from. Like Portman, I think Steve saw that people being together in something changed everything. Bowling alone was to be addressed by connecting people in ways not done before. On a personal level, Steve lobbied, agitated, cajoled, and coordinated and negotiated for community housing projects. places which for decades provided people with not just secure accommodation, but with housing that creates community, with friends, connections and support. Steve's efforts were not only for CHL, but for a movement which ultimately has grown into the entire national not-for-profit housing sector, an innovative, vibrant and no longer marginal but central part of the housing system. There are now more than 500 organisations across the country with more than 140,000 homes. The sector has assets of more than $20 billion. It supports a wide range of diverse households, individuals and families, old and young, single and older women, people escaping violence of a variety of kinds, people living with disabilities, people facing homelessness, members of the LGBTIQ community, specialist services for Aboriginal people run by and for Aboriginal people, and so on. The bricks and mortar deliver much, much more when residents are connected to their community and encouraged and empowered to support each other. Steve, along with others, was a key part of a movement who believed things could be done better and who championed for that change. And for that, we all stand today grateful, as I know are the many Australians who live in our homes. I often wondered what drives people like Steve. When we choose a path or a career, we choose much more than a job. So dig behind people you know in other professions, in doctors, teachers, nurses, lawyers, psychiatrists, whatever you want to choose, and you'll find an explanation and often a simple truth. Steve Bevington was born in Brussels to a British family. In a nomadic life, he grew up in Germany, travelled in South Korea before returning to the UK, living in Germany, and then from 1993 in Australia. In CHL, he built an organisation across not only states and territories, but across countries and continents, working with partners and opportunities wherever he could. In doing so, I wonder whether in that journey he not only gave people homes, but in CHL found himself his own home. There are many people I grew to know and like and admire in CHL, Brett and Lucy and Ryan and Preeti, John, and of course Danny Drasic, whom I tried to pinch for housing choices more than once. Great people and a great cause. Thank you again for allowing me to join you all today on behalf of the community housing sector to remember and celebrate a life well and truly lived. So however your God may or may not be, we can all pray that Steve has finally found his home, and that Robert Putman, in tracing the collapse of community in modern times, also showed us how new institutions like Community Housing Limited help take us off the lonesome highway and to the village green where our friends and families are waiting. Vale, Steve Bevington.
Good afternoon all, and thank you again for joining us today to remember Steve and reflect on incredible legacy he has left behind. My name is Danny Drasic, and it makes me incredibly proud and honoured to address you as the CEO of CHL Group. For me, it's very difficult to capture everything I would like to say about Steve in just a few minutes. He was a major influence on my professional development over the last 16 years, and he was also a very close friend. His guidance and support have been instrumental in shaping my career. I know for myself and for many of you here, he will be deeply missed. When Steve announced his plans for retirement about 18 months ago, I don't think any of us truly believed it. The idea of him letting go, leaving this organization that he built from ground up to someone else, it seemed impossible. But he made his mind up. As most of us know, once Steve sets his mind to something, he never turns back. So this determined nature was a key characteristic of CHL, has become a leader in housing those in need and working towards the mission of world without housing poverty. He passed the baton and entrusted CHL to me, the executive team and the board, to take it to its next chapter. So I'm glad to say that he was content, at peace and ready for the next phase of his life. And as an organisation, we have commenced the celebrations and farewells around the country of both his legacy and 30 years of anniversary in CHL. We started symbolically at our new old Blackburn office, which was the first office 30 years ago. It was an emotional moment and he enjoyed it. He wanted a big celebration and equally big exits for the 23rd May event. Well, he certainly made a grand exit for sure. Steve's vision for housing solutions extended far beyond our country. He saw the bigger picture, understanding the global implications and possibilities, providing affordable and suitable housing options for everyone. His passion for cause was extraordinary, and he never stopped thinking and coming up with new ideas, no matter where, how impossible or even slightly controversial they might seem. People needed housing, and that's what he knew. His innovative spirit and persistent pursuit for better solutions have left a permanent mark of CHL on myself and on our sector. Over the last few months following his passing, people called him visionary, grandfather of community housing sector, a legend. He definitely was all of that. As a leader, Steve's dedication, vision and personality have shaped the social housing narrative and helped thousands of individuals and families. Steve's legacy will continue to inspire us and guide us, not only at CHL, I'm sure. So today we stand on shoulders of a giant, a legend, and I know that we will carry forward the same passion and dedication, the same vision and the same purpose that Steve has established. Over the next 3 years, our strategy is built around these principles, emphasizing collaboration, teamwork, respect and inclusion. We purposely named this strategy Putting People First, and I know that he would be greatly and incredibly proud of his direction. In closing, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Steve for his years of service, dedication, leadership, and above all, friendship. He has left an incredible mark on all of us, and we will remember him. His legacy will continue to inspire us for many years to come. Again, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's watch a special video capturing some of Steve's in-action moments over the last 30 years. Well, I hope you enjoyed that memory, that walk down the memory lane. On behalf of Community Housing Limited, once again, I thank you for honouring Steve's memory and celebrating his legacy with us. We appreciate your presence, whether in person or virtually. I'd like to invite all of you to join us for refreshments, and please continue to exchange your stories and your reflections and connect, reminisce, and celebrate his lasting influence. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. And sorry, just one more thing. There is a QR code on the cocktail tables. If you'd like to leave a tribute for Steve, please feel free to scan that and leave a message. We'd appreciate that. Thank you.